class goggles. I think I see a major cleavage in what is called quote-unquote leftist and what is called quote-unquote rightist. In the Arab-Israeli conflict, the extent such a farce can even be called such a thing, I've noticed that the self-styled liberal doesn't really deal with the two factions as they actually exist, the Jews and the Muslims in that part of the world. Instead, they construct from the Arab population a mythical underclass. And so they side not so much with the Arabs as they actually exist in reality, but with this imaginary underclass. They don't defend the actions of Arabs, they defend the actions framed from the point of view of underclass versus overclass versus legitimate response to an oppressor or something. So far from being sophisticated or complex, this outlook simplifies the direct line to conclusions on issues. Of course, once the conclusion is reached, then the argumentation can be incredibly complex and sometimes even brilliant. But it's all after the fact. The conclusion was really reached once the overclass was defined and once the underclass was defined. In my experience, and I have no data to back this up, in my experience, blacks in the U.S. don't fall for this abstraction, okay? Blacks see blacks as they are, right? And recognize their support for, say, the Democrat Party, not as some abstract support for the oppressed. I mean, a few do, but the majority, I would say somewhere around 75% of blacks, don't view it as some abstract support for the oppressed, but as real visceral support for their race in a zero-sum contest against whites. Not against the overclass, okay, against whites. And so in that way, I would say blacks are fundamentally rightist in this. They're not wearing class goggles. And when you free your mind from these abstract spooks, you are thrust back into the world, back into history, right, with its competing nations and competing races, an endless struggle. Okay? The Arabs are not the underclass in some formulaic categorical archetype. They're Arabs. They have some advantages. They surround Israel. They're more numerous, and they're gaining ground in the popular press. Whether or not the Arabs have more generalized support in, say, Europe and the United States, I don't know, but certainly they're trending that way. So if they don't now, they will in the future if trends continue. Israel has some advantages too. They have better military technology, and they have substantial support in Washington, D.C. and the Pentagon, and they get military aid and stuff. Okay, so one side has some advantages and disadvantages, the other side has some advantages and disadvantages, right? You want to say one is the overclass, one is the underclass, well, that's just your opinion, okay? I don't see mestizos and Africans also in the United States. I don't see them as an underclass, okay? The disparate impact of drug laws, racial profiling, right, those things can be problematic for them, and all else being equal, an employer will prefer to hire a white guy, and more than a white guy, an Asian guy. But, but blacks and mestizos, they get preferential treatment in university admissions, in government contracts, and employers in the private sector need to fill diversity quotas to stave off, lawsuits and stuff. So you'll have people saying that they know which side has the advantage in these things, right? In these racialized laws and racialized behavior of employers, but they don't know, right? They don't know which side has the advantage. They're just partisans speaking from what is most of the time a preconceived position, right? Or they'll get their view that they got from a university in a class that has no empirical value and no real reality check, right? So you go into a university, you have some professor going on about white privilege. It's not falsifiable, what they're saying. 90% of the time, it's not falsifiable. There's no way to test it, and there's no way to apply what has been taught in these classes in the way you can to other things in reality, right? For example, if you take a physics class, that's something that has an empirical, practical application, right? You can really test what you have learned, right? And so the problem is that you go to a university to learn physics, and that's doing real-world things. Okay, now you're going to learn about white privilege, and they're both in a university. They're both taught by PhDs, and so you imagine that the veracity of what you're taught about white privilege is similar to the veracity of what you're taught about mathematics and physics, okay, when it's not. Okay, one subject is chained to reality, another is free from the constraints of reality, right? Moreover, blacks and mestizos can be explicitly racially nationalistic, while when whites do it, it's supremacism or hate or whatever. And some people will ask with a straight face if blacks can even be quote-unquote racist at all. So sure, I'll check my privilege. I have a much easier time shoplifting because the employees have their eyes on the black people. Okay, and that's something I've noticed, and it's a certain advantage that I have. Okay, I'm less likely to get pulled over. I'm less likely to get frisked or hassled by the cops, right? Because I'm I'm white. So I'll check my privilege there, and you check your privilege when you get into Columbia with the 1250 SAT, math and verbal. And maybe your higher credentials, coupled with some diversity quotas, will offset the fact that companies tend to prefer whites and Asians to blacks, all else being equal. Okay, so maybe that'll offset that, or maybe it won't. I don't know, and neither do you. To recap, classes don't exist. What exists are different races and nations. Right? Groups definitely do exist, and group dynamics definitely do exist. Okay? Each with different traits in the inevitable and involuntary power struggle of existence. To see the world with class goggles collapses reality into these stilted absolutes of oppressor and oppressed, and results in you being a useful idiot for whoever you decide is the oppressed at any given place and time.